When Jonathan Roumie stepped onto the set of the Steve Harvey Show, the atmosphere crackled with excitement. The audience was primed for laughs, charm, and perhaps a few stories about Roumie's role as Jesus in The Chosen. Steve Harvey, with his infectious humor and heartfelt presence, was ready to lead the conversation. But when Roumie's eyes caught the small crucifix dangling from Steve's chest, the energy shifted. The tone deepened, the purpose sharpened. What began as a lively interview was about to transform into something profound. In the next few minutes, Steve wouldn't be the one driving the questions. He'd be the one struggling to hold back tears, undone by words he never saw coming. It all started with one quiet sentence from Roumie. "Steve, can I share something I've never told anyone before?" The studio buzzed as the crowd settled, their anticipation thick in the air. The show's theme song faded, and Steve strode across the stage, his signature half-grin lighting up the room. Cue cards in hand, his eyes sparkled with warmth, but there was something else, a sense that tonight was different. From the moment the cameras rolled, Steve felt it, an undercurrent that hinted at something sacred waiting to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice brimming with admiration, "we've got a special guest tonight. You know him as the heart of The Chosen, bringing Jesus to life. But I'm telling you, this man's soul is what makes him shine. Give it up for Jonathan Roumie." The audience roared as Roumie walked out, dressed in a simple dark sweater and jeans. No flash, just authenticity. He waved briefly, his smile shy, almost uneasy under the wave of applause. As he took his seat beside Steve, the room's energy softened, less showbiz, more truth. "Man, this is a lot," Roumie said, chuckling softly, his voice genuine. "I'm just a guy trying to do my best." Steve leaned in, his grin wide. "That's exactly why they love you, brother. You don't try to be a star. You just are." They eased into the conversation, touching on The Chosen, its global impact, and Roumie's path as an actor. But Steve, always attuned to deeper currents, pushed further. "Jonathan, folks talk about your kindness," he said, his tone playful yet sincere. "Stories about you helping crew members, treating everyone like family. Is that real, or is Hollywood just selling us a good guy?" The crowd laughed, but Roumie's response was steady, thoughtful. "It's real, Steve," he said. "It's not about being a hero. It's about seeing people. Everyone's carrying a load. A kind word, a small gesture, it can shift someone's whole day. Sometimes their whole life." Steve nodded, his eyes narrowing with respect. "You sound like you've walked some heavy roads," he said, his voice quieter now. Roumie didn't shy away. "I have," he said simply. "I've lost people I loved. I've faced darkness. When you go through that, you learn nothing's guaranteed. You either shut down or you open up. I chose to open." The audience fell silent, every word landing like a stone in still water. Steve's fingers brushed the crucifix on his chest, an instinct, not a performance. "That's real talk," he said softly. "You're not sounding like an actor right now. You're sounding like a man who's been tested." The conversation turned to faith, not as a lecture, but as a shared understanding. Steve leaned forward. "Playing Jesus, that's a big responsibility," he said. "Does it change how you see God? How you feel Him in your life?" Roumie paused, his eyes drifting briefly, as if sifting through memories. "It's not the role that changed me," he said. "It's the quiet moments. The times when I'm alone, questioning, doubting, wrestling. That's where I feel something greater. It's not always loud or clear, but it's always there, like a presence that doesn't leave." Steve's hand closed around the crucifix. "That's faith," he said, his voice low. "Even when it's just a whisper, even when it's messy." Roumie's gaze settled on the cross Steve wore. His expression shifted, a flicker of something deeper crossing his face. "Steve," he said, his voice softer, almost tentative, "can I tell you something I've never shared in public?" Steve froze, his showman's polish giving way to raw attention. He nodded, his eyes locked on Roumie. Go ahead, brother, he said. The audience held its breath, sensing the weight of the moment. Roumie took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying himself. There was a night, he began, a few years back when I didn't think I could keep going. I was in a dark place. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, wasn't sure I wanted to be here anymore. The world felt like it was closing in, heavy and empty all at once. Steve didn't move, but his eyes softened, recognizing the pain in those words. I was alone, Roumie continued, sitting in the dark, trying to feel something, anything to hold on to. I picked up my phone, not even sure what I was looking for. And I found a clip of you. Steve blinked, caught off guard. You were speaking at an event, Roumie said, talking about purpose, about how God doesn't waste pain. You were wearing that crucifix, the same one you've got on now. And you said something that hit me like a lifeline. If you're still breathing, God's not done with you yet. Steve's lips parted, his hand tightening on the cross. I watched that clip over and over, Roumie said, his voice trembling just slightly. Not because it fixed everything, but because it reminded me I wasn't invisible. You didn't know me, Steve, but you spoke to me. You gave me a reason to get out of bed the next morning. Steve's eyes glistened, his chest rising with a shaky breath. Man, he said, his voice thick, I was just talking from my heart. I had no idea. Roumie shook his head gently. That's why it worked. You weren't trying to be anything. You were just real. And that saved me. The studio was silent, a sacred stillness settling over the room. Steve wiped a tear, trying to steady himself. You're telling me my words reached you in a moment like that? He asked, his voice raw. Roumie nodded. Not just your words. It was how you carried them. The way you wore that cross, like it wasn't just a symbol but a promise. I looked at you and thought, this man believes in something bigger. Maybe I can too. Steve let out a broken laugh, shaking his head. I'm just a comedian, man. I'm not a preacher. Roumie leaned forward, his voice firm. You're more than that, Steve. You're a minister in disguise. And I've got something else to tell you, something that might change your life the way you changed mine. Steve's eyes widened, a mix of awe and uncertainty crossing his face. The audience leaned in, feeling the gravity of what was coming. I'm listening, Steve whispered, his voice barely audible. The moment stretched, heavy with truth, as if the stage had become a sanctuary. Roumie sat back, his gaze steady but warm, as if preparing to open a door long kept shut. That night wasn't the only time you reached me, he said. Over the years, I kept hearing your voice in clips from your shows, in speeches you gave, in moments when you talked about faith, about pain, about getting back up. You said things that became a map through my own storms. Steve tilted his head, his eyes searching Roumie's face. What things? He asked, his voice raw with emotion. Roumie took a breath, his tone reverent, as if reciting something holy. You said, God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. You said it doesn't matter if you feel ready or worthy. If God puts a microphone in your hand, you speak. You said pain has a language, and when someone who's been through it talks, it cuts through everything else. Steve's lips trembled, the memory of those words hitting him hard. He'd said them years ago, after a low point in his own life, when he'd poured his soul into a speech with no plan, no script. I remember that, Steve said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was hurting when I said it. Didn't think anybody was really listening. Roumie shook his head. I was listening. And I wasn't the only one. You were speaking to people you'll never meet, in places you'll never see. You were speaking to me, sitting in the dark, wondering if my life still had purpose. And that cross you wore, it was like a beacon, a reminder that faith isn't just words. It's showing up, even when you're broken. Steve's hand rested on the crucifix, his fingers tracing its edges. You saw all that in a clip? He asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Roumie nodded. I saw a man who'd walked through fire and still carried light. You didn't just talk about faith, Steve. You lived it. And that gave me permission to keep going. Steve leaned back, his eyes wet, his chest heaving. Man, I don't know what to say, he admitted. I've spent my life trying to make folks laugh, trying to survive my own pain. I didn't think I was doing anything special. That's what makes it special, Roumie said, his voice steady but warm. You weren't trying to be a savior. You were just being you. And because of that, you reached someone who was drowning. You reached me. The audience sat still, some wiping tears, others in quiet reverence. Steve looked out at them, then back at Roumie. You're saying I helped you find hope? He asked. Roumie smiled faintly. More than that. You reminded me hope isn't something you find. It's something you choose. And seeing you choose it, wearing that cross, speaking from your scars, that made me believe I could choose it too. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. When he opened them, he looked at Roumie with a question. You said you had something to tell me, he said, his voice soft but urgent. Something that might change my life. What is it? Roumie's expression grew serious, his eyes unwavering. I've carried your words for years, he said. And tonight, I need to give them back to you, because I think you've forgotten their power. You said, sometimes you're not the one being rescued. You're the one doing the rescuing, and you don't even know it. You said your pain is your ministry, that God uses the broken to reach the broken. Steve's breath caught, his hand tightening on the cross. I said that, he whispered, the memory flooding back. Roumie nodded. You did, and you were right. You've been rescuing people, Steve, without realizing it. You've been a light for people in the dark, people like me, but I think you've doubted it. I think you've wondered if what you do matters, if your voice carries weight. I'm here to tell you it does. It carried me out of a place I didn't think I'd leave. Steve's head dropped, his shoulders shaking as tears spilled freely. The audience didn't move, their silence a kind of prayer. Roumie leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. You're not just a host, Steve. You're not just a comedian. You're a minister, whether you planned it or not. That cross you wear, it's not just a symbol. It's a sign. And tonight, I need to tell you something I've held on to, something I believe was meant for you. Steve looked up, his eyes red, his face open. What is it? He asked, his voice trembling. Roumie took a deep breath, his words slow and deliberate. You said, God doesn't always use the mighty or the perfect. Sometimes he picks the unlikely, the ones nobody expects, because they know how to reach people the strong can't. Steve, that's you. You're the unlikely one. You didn't go to seminary. You didn't grow up with a silver spoon. You fought through pain, through loss, through doubt. And God saw your scars and said, this is the one I'll use. You've been carrying his message. Not in a church, but in comedy clubs, on TV sets, in moments when you thought you were just talking. Steve's lips parted, but no words came. He was undone, his hands covering his face for a moment. Roumie's voice softened, almost a whisper. You've been a beacon, Steve, not because you're flawless, but because you're real. You've saved lives not by preaching, but by showing up. And I need you to know that, because sometimes the ones carrying the light forget how bright it shines. Steve let out a sound-part laugh, part sob, part awe. I was just trying to make it, he said, his voice breaking. Trying to get through my own mess. That's why it worked, Roumie said. Your mess is your message. Your pain is your power. You didn't have to be perfect. You just had to be faithful. The studio felt different now, like a sanctuary, not a stage. The audience sat in reverent silence, some holding hands, others wiping tears. Steve looked at Roumie, his eyes searching. You really believe that? He asked. That God's using me, even with all my flaws? Roumie nodded, his voice certain. I know it. I'm proof. And so are they. He gestured toward the audience, their faces reflecting the weight of the moment. Steve leaned back, his hand still on the cross, his chest rising with slow breaths. I've doubted it, he admitted. I've wondered if I'm enough, If I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. Roumie's eyes didn't waver. You are, he said. You're doing more than you know. Every time you speak from your heart, every time you wear that cross, you're telling someone they're not alone. You're telling them God's not done with them. You did that for me. And I'm not the only one. The moment stretched, heavy with truth. Steve's gaze drifted to the audience, then back to Roumie. You said you had something to tell me, he said again, his voice steadier now, but still raw. Something that might change my life. Lay it on me, brother. Roumie smiled faintly, his expression a mix of gratitude and resolve. I've told you how you saved me, he said. But I haven't told you why I'm here tonight. Years ago, when I watched that clip of you, I made a promise to myself. If I ever got the chance to meet you, I'd tell you what you did for me. But I'd also remind you of something you might have forgotten. Steve tilted his head, waiting. Roumie's voice grew quieter, but every word carried weight. You said, your pain is your ministry. Your scars are your sermon. You said God uses the broken to reach the broken, because they speak a language the perfect can't. Steve, you've been living that truth, but I think you've doubted your own power. I'm here to tell you, don't. Your voice, your story, your faith, they're changing lives. They changed mine. And they're not done yet. Steve's eyes filled again, his hand gripping the cross like an anchor. Man, he said, his voice cracking, I don't even know how to take this. Roumie leaned forward, his tone gentle but urgent. Take it as truth. You're not just making people laugh. You're giving them hope. You're showing them that faith isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, scars and all. And that cross you wear, it's a reminder, not just for you, but for everyone watching. It says God's still working, even in the mess. Steve let out a long breath, his shoulders shaking. The audience was still, their silence a kind of witness. Roumie's voice came one last time, soft but piercing. You matter, Steve, not for what you do, but for who you are. You've carried faith into places where it was fading, including my heart. And I'm here to tell you, keep going. Because someone out there, right now, is waiting for your voice to pull them through. Steve covered his face, tears streaming. The studio felt like it held its breath, the moment too sacred for applause. Then, something unexpected happened. Steve stood, his body trembling not with weakness but with something deeper. He looked at Roumie, his eyes wet but alive. I've had a lot of moments on this stage, he said, his voice raw. But this is the greatest gift I've ever gotten. Roumie stood too, and without a word, they embraced not as host and guest, but as two men bound by grace. The audience rose slowly, reverently, their silence louder than any cheer. Steve turned to them, his voice cracking but strong. I don't know what to say, he said, except thank you. And let's pray. In that moment, the studio wasn't just a set. It was a sanctuary. Two men, shaped by pain, became vessels of healing. The cameras kept rolling, but it didn't feel like TV anymore. It felt like truth. Steve's crucifix gleamed under the lights, a quiet signal that faith doesn't need a pulpit to preach. It just needs a heart willing to speak. The moment lingered, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And for those watching, from retirees in Florida to teachers in Ohio, it was a reminder, sometimes the ones carrying the light don't know how bright it shines. But the story didn't end there. After the show, the studio emptied, the lights dimmed, and the crew began packing up. Steve stayed behind, sitting alone on the stage, his hands clasped, the crucifix still resting against his chest. He replayed Roumie's words in his mind. You're a minister in disguise. He'd spent years doubting his worth, wondering if his comedy, his hustle, his faith amounted to anything lasting. Now those doubts felt different, not gone, but softened by truth. He thought of his own journey growing up in Cleveland, scraping by, facing rejection, losing battles with his own demons. I was just trying to survive, he'd told Roumie. But maybe survival was the sermon. Backstage, Roumie lingered too, talking quietly with the producer. "Did I say too much?" he asked, his voice low, almost uncertain. The producer, a veteran named Linda, shook her head. "You said what needed saying," she told him. "I've worked this show 10 years. I've never seen Steve like that." Roumie nodded, his eyes distant. "I didn't plan to go there," he admitted. "But sitting across from him, seeing that cross, it felt like I had to." Linda smiled faintly. "You didn't just speak to Steve tonight. You spoke to all of us." The next day, the clip of their exchange was everywhere, not on screens, but in conversations. People shared it in church groups, at family dinners, in quiet moments with friends. A pastor in Atlanta used it in his Sunday sermon, calling it dignity in the light. Steve Harvey didn't know he was preaching, he told his congregation, but God knew. And Jonathan Roumie reminded him. A teacher in Chicago showed it to her high school class, asking, "What does it mean to carry faith in your work?" Her students, usually restless, sat still, one girl whispering, "It means being real." A retired nurse in Memphis wrote Steve a letter. "I've watched your show for years," she said. "I always laughed, but last night I cried. You and Jonathan showed me that faith isn't just in churches, it's in us." Steve read it in his office, his eyes misting again. He'd gotten thousands of letters over the years, but this one felt different. It wasn't about his jokes or his hosting. It was about his heart. He tucked it into a drawer, next to a worn Bible he hadn't opened in months. For Roumie, the aftermath was quieter but no less profound. He flew back to Los Angeles, sitting alone on the plane, replaying the moment. He hadn't planned to share so much, to bear his darkest night on national TV. But something about Steve, his openness, his faith, that cross had pulled it out of him. He thought of his own losses. A childhood marked by instability, a sister's illness, a partner gone too soon, a child who never took a breath. Grief is quiet, he'd told Steve, but so was hope. And somehow Steve's words had found him in that silence years ago, and given him a reason to keep going. Weeks later, Steve invited Roumie to a small event in Atlanta, not for TV, but for community, a gathering of youth mentors and local leaders. "I want you to talk to them," Steve told him over the phone. "Not as an actor, but as you. They need to hear what you said to me." Roumie hesitated. "I'm no speaker, Steve," he said. "I just told my truth." Steve laughed, his voice warm. "That's why they need you, brother. Your truth is the sermon." Roumie agreed, and when he stood before the group, he didn't talk about The Chosen or Hollywood. He talked about pain, about faith, about the night Steve's words pulled him through. "You don't have to be perfect to make a difference," he told them. "You just have to show up." A young mentor named Marcus approached him after, his voice quiet. "I've been mentoring kids for years," he said, "but I've doubted if I'm enough. Hearing you and Steve, I get it now. It's not about being enough, it's about being real." Roumie smiled, his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "That's it," he said. "That's the ministry." Marcus nodded, his eyes bright. "I'm keeping that cross on my keychain from now on," he said, pulling out a small silver crucifix. "It's my reminder." Months later, Steve and Roumie met again, this time on the set of Family Feud. It wasn't planned, just a quick visit while Roumie was in town. They sat backstage, away from the cameras, two men who'd shared something sacred. "You changed how I see myself," Steve told him, his voice low. "I've always thought I was just a guy telling jokes, trying to make it. But you made me see I'm more." Roumie shook his head gently. "You were always more, Steve. I just held up a mirror." Steve chuckled, his eyes warm. "Well, that mirror's got some power, brother." They talked about faith, about doubt, about the weight of carrying a message. "Sometimes I still wonder if I'm doing it right," Steve admitted. "If I'm living up to what God wants." Roumie looked at him, his voice steady. "You're doing it, Steve. Every time you show up, every time you speak from your heart, you're doing it. That cross you wear, it's proof. Steve touched the crucifix, his fingers lingering. You know, he said, I used to wear this just because it felt right. Now I wear it because it means something. It means I'm part of something bigger. Roumie nodded, his smile faint but real. That's the call, he said. Not to be perfect, but to be faithful. You've been faithful, Steve, and you've got no idea how many lives you've touched. Steve leaned back, his eyes distant. I'm starting to get it, he said. Thanks to you. The moment was quiet, not grand, but deep. Two men, bound by a shared truth, carrying their scars and their light. The crucifix on Steve's chest gleamed faintly, a silent testament to a faith that didn't need a stage to shine. Years later, the clip of that night would still be shared not for its drama, but for its honesty. People would watch it in church basements, in living rooms, in moments when they needed to remember that faith wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up. A pastor in Detroit would call it the gospel of the cross, saying, Steve Harvey didn't know he was preaching, but Jonathan Roumie knew. And he reminded us all. A grandmother in Houston would show it to her grandkids, saying, this is what it means to carry God in your heart. A soldier in Virginia would keep a still from the clip Steve and Roumie embracing tucked in his wallet, a reminder of hope in hard times. For Steve, the moment never faded. He'd go on hosting, joking, inspiring, but something had shifted. He wore the crucifix with a new weight, not as a symbol, but as a signal. He'd doubt himself again, old habits die hard, but when he did, he'd think of Roumie's words, your pain is your ministry. And he'd keep going. For Roumie, the night was a turning point too. He'd always seen acting as his craft, but now he saw it as a calling, a way to carry light into dark places. You don't have to be Jesus to share his love, he'd tell a friend later. You just have to be real. The world kept turning, but that night on the Steve Harvey Show left a mark. It wasn't about fame or ratings. It was about two men, broken and faithful, reminding each other and everyone watching that faith is a choice, a quiet act of courage. Steve's crucifix, small and simple, became a beacon, not just for him, but for anyone who saw it and believed. And for those who watched, it was a call. Carry your light, even when you don't know who's watching. Because someone, somewhere, is waiting for it to guide them home. If you believe your voice matters, even when it shakes, subscribe and share a story of yours in the comments. Remember, silence never changed anything.
Thank you for watching our channel Modern Stories. If you liked our video, you should subscribe for more amazing videos like this. Have a healthy and happy day. See you in the next one.